She wrapped her arm around me like it was nothing, but my heart knew it was everything. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when I first met her, my friend's aunt, a woman who seemed to exist just slightly outside the rhythm of ordinary life. I had come over for a casual gathering at my friend's house, expecting the usual chatter, the laughter bouncing around in a comfortable, familiar pattern. But then she appeared. She moved through the room with a quiet grace that drew my attention without effort. She was older, maybe in her early 40s, but the way she carried herself suggested a calm confidence shaped by life experience, not vanity. Her presence was unassuming yet magnetic. She wore a soft blouse that hinted at elegance, paired with jeans that didn't try too hard to impress, and I noticed the subtle scent of her perfume, something warm, faintly floral, comforting but not cloying. Our introduction was casual, almost accidental. My friend gestured toward me, saying, "You've got to meet my aunt." She extended her hand, and when I shook it, the contact was brief but lingered just long enough for me to sense a warmth that went beyond a typical handshake. Her smile was small, knowing, almost mischievous, and it seemed to carry a weight of unspoken stories. As we stood talking, her body language was open but unintentional in its intimacy. She leaned slightly closer than necessary, her hand brushing my arm once or twice as she gestured. Each touch was light, almost incidental, yet my skin seemed to remember it long after. I felt a strange combination of comfort and awareness, as if the air between us carried a quiet tension I didn't fully understand. She laughed at a story my friend told, and the sound seemed to fill the room, warm and easy. I noticed the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, the slight dip of her chin, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so familiar, yet somehow new to me. I wanted to ask her about it, to understand the ease she carried herself with, but I hesitated. Part of me wondered if I was reading too much into ordinary movements, but the rest of me knew there was something undeniably magnetic in her presence. There was a rhythm to her movements, a casual confidence, and yet, beneath it, a quiet vulnerability I could sense but couldn't name. Every small gesture, the tilt of her head, the way she listened, felt charged with meaning I wasn't fully prepared for. I found myself watching her more closely than I should have, noticing the warmth in her smile, the softness in her voice, and the way she seemed to exist in a space slightly removed from everyone else, yet fully present with me. By the time our conversation ended, I felt a pull I couldn't articulate, a curiosity that lingered in my chest. Meeting her wasn't just a casual introduction. It was the beginning of something quietly stirring, something that promised to unfold slowly, intimately, and with a depth I hadn't anticipated. In that first encounter, the ordinary warmth of a family gathering was punctuated by a subtle spark, one that I couldn't ignore, no matter how much I tried to tell myself it was nothing more than polite friendliness. And yet, the moment her arm brushed against mine, fleeting and accidental, I realized the day had already changed. A week after that first meeting, I found myself at my friend's house again, this time for a quieter evening. Just a few friends, soft music in the background, and the faint aroma of coffee lingering in the air. She was there, as if she belonged to every corner of the room, yet somehow existed in her own space. The warmth I had felt during our first encounter seemed to gather itself around her, subtle but undeniable. We sat on the couch together, not out of deliberate choice, but because of the way the room had arranged itself. She was beside me before I even realized it, her body leaning slightly toward mine, an almost unconscious gesture of closeness. And then it happened. Her arm slipped around my shoulder. Just like that, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The touch was light at first, a casual brush, but the moment she rested her arm fully, I felt a quiet shock ripple through me. There was warmth, softness, and a subtle weight, enough to make me acutely aware of the space we now shared. Her presence pressed against mine, not forcefully, not demanding attention, yet impossible to ignore. I could feel the steady beat of her pulse against my upper arm, a quiet rhythm that somehow reached straight to my chest. Her expression remained calm, almost playful, as she continued the conversation around us. She laughed at a joke someone told, her eyes occasionally meeting mine, warm and steady, as if inviting me to notice her closeness without saying a word. I tried to focus on the words, but every brush of her hand, Every subtle shift in posture pulled my attention back. My thoughts scattered between embarrassment, curiosity, and a fascination I couldn't name. The softness of her sweater against my skin, the gentle warmth of her arm, small details, but impossible to ignore, made the ordinary evening feel charged with an intimacy I wasn't prepared for. I felt a tangle of emotions: excitement, nervousness, and a hesitant thrill. Her comfort in being close to me made me want to relax, to lean in a little, to just exist within the warmth of her presence. What struck me most was the ease with which she had done it. There was no hint of pretense, no suggestion that she expected anything from me. She simply allowed herself to touch, to be near, and in doing so, invited me into a space of quiet familiarity I had never known. The arm around me wasn't a gesture meant to provoke, yet it provoked all the same, a tension between innocence and something deeper, something unspoken. By the end of the evening, when she finally withdrew her arm, I realized I had been holding my breath. The ordinary had been transformed into something quietly extraordinary. And as I walked home that night, the memory of her arm around me lingered, warm, grounding, and impossibly intimate. It was a simple gesture, casual to the world, but to me, it had opened a door I wasn't ready to close. In that single moment, familiarity became fascination, and the slow, subtle pull between us began to take shape, an invisible thread tying two very different worlds together, one touch at a time. A few days later, I found myself alone with her, just the two of us in the quiet corner of a small cafe my friend had suggested. The warm aroma of brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of her perfume, a subtle floral that made the room feel suddenly smaller, more intimate. The chatter around us faded into background noise, and in that moment, it felt like we were suspended outside ordinary time. She had this way of looking at me that made my thoughts stumble. Her gaze was steady, curious, almost teasing, like she knew I was trying too hard to act casual. She laughed at something I said, a soft, melodic sound that seemed to linger in the space between us. And then she leaned slightly closer, her hand brushing mine across the table, not accidental, but light enough to leave me questioning whether I had imagined it. "Did you even notice I said that?" she asked, tilting her head with a small smirk. There was a playfulness in her tone, but also a gentle challenge. I found myself blinking, caught off guard by how easy it was to be flustered in her presence. My hands felt suddenly heavy, my words slower, yet I couldn't look away. There was a warmth in her teasing, a comfort that allowed me to laugh nervously, despite the awareness of how much she affected me. She shifted in her seat, the movement casual yet deliberate, a subtle nudge closer that wasn't quite touching but was intimate enough to stir a strange flutter in my chest. The light of the cafe fell across her features, highlighting the calm confidence in her smile and the gentle curve of her jaw. Every small gesture, the brush of her fingers as she reached for her cup, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, felt magnified, as if I were seeing her in slow motion, noticing details I had missed the first time. The conversation danced effortlessly between playful and personal. She teased me about my habits, my awkward pauses, the way I overthink simple things, and I found myself smiling in a way I hadn't in a long time. Her teasing wasn't cruel. It was affectionate, a gentle pull that invited me to open up without words. And when she laughed at my flustered responses, I felt a warmth bloom in my chest, a mix of admiration, nervousness, and a subtle longing I hadn't dared to name. Every so often, her hand would brush mine again, this time lingering just a fraction longer. I could feel the warmth of her skin through the fabric, the gentle pressure that spoke of comfort and an unspoken curiosity. It was intimate in a way that didn't demand anything, yet left me acutely aware of the quiet tension growing between us. By the time we left the cafe, the sunlight had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the street. I walked beside her, trying to match her easy pace, but every so often, our shoulders brushed, our hands almost touching. And in that fleeting closeness, I realized the playful teasing had done more than make me smile. It had drawn me closer to her, weaving a thread of curiosity and desire that I wasn't ready to unravel. That day, I understood something vital. Connection wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, it was in the teasing glance, the light brush of fingers, the subtle ways a person could make you feel seen, understood, and inexplicably drawn to them, all without ever saying the words that truly mattered. It was during a rainy evening when the walls between us felt thinner, almost fragile. I had stopped by my friend's place to return a book I'd borrowed, expecting a quick exchange and polite chatter. Instead, I found her sitting alone by the window, the gray light of the storm casting soft shadows across her face. She looked different, less composed, more human, and for the first time, the confident aura I had admired seemed softened by quiet vulnerability. She greeted me with a small smile, but there was a weight in her eyes I hadn't noticed before. I took a seat beside her, careful not to break the delicate atmosphere, and we watched the rain streak the glass in slow, irregular lines. The sound of the droplets against the window pane was comforting, almost hypnotic, and in the quiet, she began to speak, not about the usual pleasantries, but about something personal. "It's just some days feel heavier than others," she said, her voice low and calm, but threaded with a subtle ache. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight fidgeting of her fingers as they traced the edge of the windowsill. There was a raw honesty in her words, an invitation to witness a part of her that few ever saw. I felt a sudden, protective impulse, a desire to offer comfort without intruding, to exist as a steady presence beside her. I didn't say much at first, just listened, letting her voice fill the room. The silence between her words was just as meaningful as the words themselves, the pauses that allowed the weight of her feelings to settle, the quiet sighs she didn't try to hide. Every small movement she made, from tucking a strand of hair behind her ear to shifting slightly closer on the bench, carried an intimacy that felt almost tangible. When she looked at me, there was a flicker of something unspoken, trust, a subtle recognition of the shared human struggle that transcended age or circumstance. My heart thumped quietly in response, attuned to the gentle rhythm of her breathing, the warmth radiating from her as we sat together. I wanted to reach out, to offer a hand on hers, but hesitated, respecting the boundary between comfort and intrusion, yet aching to close the distance. The rain continued its steady murmur, and in that quiet space, our connection deepened. She spoke of her past regrets, her small triumphs, the bittersweet blend of laughter and sorrow that life had woven for her. I felt a pull in my chest, a mixture of admiration, empathy, and an unnameable longing. It wasn't about desire in the conventional sense. It was the magnetic draw of someone revealing their inner self, someone letting you in without reservation. By the time she fell silent, I realized that the small gestures, the way her fingers lingered on the windowsill, the warmth in her eyes, the calm steadiness of her voice, had spoken louder than words ever could. Our connection had shifted from playful curiosity to something deeper, more tender, a quiet intimacy that neither of us could ignore. As I left that evening, I carried with me a sense of closeness that was both exhilarating and humbling. For the first time, I understood that true intimacy wasn't always in bold gestures or confessions. It was in the subtle, human moments, the shared vulnerability that drew two hearts closer, one quiet breath at a time. The summer evening had a calmness that made the world feel slower, almost suspended. I was at my friend's house again, helping with some casual chores while she lingered nearby, moving about with her usual quiet grace. The sun had dipped low, casting long, golden streaks of light through the windows, and the room seemed to hum with a warmth that went beyond temperature, a warmth that existed only when she was near. We found ourselves sitting together on the old couch in the living room. The casual seating arrangement should have been ordinary, but with her beside me, it suddenly felt charged. I was hyper-aware of the space we shared, of the faint brush of her hair against my arm as she reached for her drink, of the soft exhale she let out as she settled into the cushions. There was no deliberate intimacy, yet every small movement felt weighted, meaningful, unspoken. Her presence pressed gently against me. The faint warmth from her shoulder radiated subtly, and I could feel the rhythm of her breathing, slow and calm, blending with my own. My thoughts spun quietly, every instinct telling me to remain composed while every nerve seemed attuned to her nearness. I could sense the delicate tension in the air, the unspoken acknowledgement that our closeness carried something more than casual familiarity. She laughed softly at something my friend said in the kitchen, and I noticed her eyes flick toward me, a fleeting look that seemed to linger just a fraction longer than necessary. That small glance, quiet, yet piercing, made my chest tighten in a way I didn't entirely understand. It was the kind of moment that whispered desire without needing words, the kind of intimacy that sneaks in through shared silences and simple touches. Her hand brushed mine as she adjusted her position, and though the contact was light, I felt it ripple through me like a quiet electric current. There was a deliberate ease in the way she moved, as if her body knew exactly how to communicate closeness without overstepping. I wanted to respond, to let my hand linger near hers, but I held back, aware of the fragile line we were walking between social decorum and emotional magnetism. The conversation was easy, flowing in soft tones that matched the fading light. We shared quiet observations about the room, the day, the weather outside. Yet every casual exchange was punctuated by subtle gestures, shoulders brushing, a fleeting hand movement, a shift closer on the couch, that made the unspoken tension almost tangible. There was an invisible thread connecting us, taut and humming, binding us in a way neither of us fully acknowledged, yet both of us felt keenly. As the evening wore on and the shadows grew long, I realized the truth. The attraction between us was no longer subtle. It was present in every glance, every brush of skin, every small, shared moment. And yet, it remained unspoken, delicate, and poised on the edge of something more. I left that night with a head full of thoughts, a chest full of warmth, and a single, undeniable certainty. Being near her was no longer just comforting. It was essential, and every moment of lingering closeness made that impossibly clear. It was late evening, and the house was quiet, save for the soft ticking of a clock and the faint hum of city life outside. We had ended up alone in the living room, the rest of the family having retreated to their rooms. The dim light cast a warm glow across her features, softening the confident lines of her face into something tender, approachable, almost fragile. I could feel the weight of the moment before a word was even spoken. We sat side by side on the couch, close enough that the warmth from her arm brushed mine, and I became painfully aware of every subtle motion, every shift in her posture, every gentle exhale, every delicate brush of her fingers as she reached for her cup. Her presence filled the room, yet there was a quiet tension between us, an unspoken question hovering in the air like electricity. "I sometimes wonder what it would be like," she began, her voice low, hesitant, almost afraid of being interrupted. She paused, as though weighing the right words, her fingers curling slightly around the edge of her sleeve. My chest tightened, heart racing with anticipation and fear, because I knew she was opening a door that both of us had been circling for weeks. I wanted to speak, to confess the feelings that had been growing quietly in my chest, the fascination, the admiration, the magnetic pull I felt whenever she was near. But the words tangled in my throat. I was acutely aware of the age gap, the social expectations, the fragile line between propriety and desire. Yet, as I met her gaze, I saw that same hesitation mirrored there, the careful restraint hiding longing that neither of us could fully deny. She leaned slightly closer, just enough that the warmth from her shoulder pressed gently against mine. I could feel the subtle rhythm of her breathing, a quiet metronome that seemed to echo my own nervous pulse. Every instinct urged me to reach out, to let my hand brush against hers, to close the small gap between us, but respect and uncertainty held me back, tethering my desire to reason. "I don't know if I should say this," she continued, her words fragile, like a candle flame trembling in a draft. And then she stopped, eyes flicking downward for just a moment, before returning to meet mine. That brief hesitation, that almost confession, hung in the air, and I realized that the unspoken feelings between us were no longer subtle. They were undeniable, intense, and terrifyingly close. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The silence was heavy, full of words that didn't need to be spoken. I could feel the tension, the quiet longing, the delicate vulnerability that had been building over weeks of subtle touches, lingering glances, and small shared moments. It was a climax not of drama, but of emotion, pure, slow-burning, and achingly real. When the clock ticked on, we shifted slightly apart, yet the energy remained. No words had crossed the line, but we both knew what lingered between us. the desire, the hesitation, the fragile, electric connection that neither of us could ignore. And in that quiet, suspended space, I realized the truth. We were standing on the edge of something profound, something we both longed for, but were not yet ready to fully claim. The next afternoon, sunlight spilled softly through the windows, washing the living room in a warm, golden glow. The air carried the faint scent of fresh coffee and something indefinably hers, subtle, comforting, familiar. I had come over under the pretense of helping my friend with some small tasks, but the quiet moments alone with her had already begun to feel inevitable, like gravity pulling us closer. We found ourselves side by side on the couch once again. This time, there was no hesitation, no tension hovering like an invisible barrier. She smiled at me, not teasingly, not cautiously, but fully, her eyes calm and steady. And as we settled, her hand brushed lightly against mine, a gentle, almost casual touch that felt like a promise. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my fingers rest near hers, feeling the warmth and reassurance that had been building between us for weeks. There was a pause, a quiet moment where the room seemed to shrink to just the two of us. The rhythm of her breathing, the soft weight of her arm close to mine, and the slight tilt of her head toward me communicated everything words could not. I realized then that the weeks of subtle touches, lingering glances, and quiet conversations had all led to this. A space where closeness was no longer uncertain, where our connection could simply exist and be acknowledged without fear. We talked softly about ordinary things, the weather, a shared memory from the gathering, a small joke, but every word was layered with the comfort and understanding that only intimacy can bring. The playfulness of our earlier teasing had evolved into a gentle, mutual ease. She leaned slightly closer, her shoulder pressing gently against mine, and I felt the familiar warmth spread through my chest, steadying me and grounding the moment. At one point, her hand rested lightly on my forearm, her fingers brushing in a way that felt both casual and deliberate. I noticed the subtle pulse of her touch, the quiet steadiness that mirrored the emotional connection we had been nurturing. It was affectionate, warm, and entirely safe, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement of what had grown between us. We sat like that for a while, silent but connected, each aware of the space we now shared. The age gap, the social expectations, and the unspoken fears that had once seemed so significant now felt like distant shadows, softened by trust and mutual respect. What mattered was the presence of one another, the quiet intimacy that needed no explanation or justification. As I left that afternoon, she walked me to the door, our hands brushing briefly in a lingering, comfortable touch. I looked back at her, and she smiled. A small, knowing smile that held warmth, trust, and unspoken understanding. The connection we had nurtured over time wasn't just acknowledged. It was accepted, mutual, and perfectly natural. For the first time, the slow-burn tension that had defined our relationship transformed into something steady and grounding. It was no longer about hesitation or unspoken desire. It was about shared presence, quiet affection, and the gentle joy of being close to someone who saw you fully and welcomed you without reservation. And in that soft, human intimacy, I realized that the story had reached its natural conclusion, a warm, satisfying resolution, born not of passion alone, but of trust, respect, and the enduring power of a quietly nurtured connection. If this story touched you, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more slow-burn, heartwarming romances. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how you'd feel in a moment like this.